Today we're going to make the Woodstock Messenger Bag. We're just going to show you a quick demonstration of the embroidery. The embroidery is all the same basically on the panels. So we're going to put our batting onto our stabilizer, trim it back to 1 to 2 millimeters away from the stitching, place our fabric on top, and then start our embroidery process. The fabric we're using is actually a denim which we have upcycled a pair of jeans, so you'll see some raggy edges on some of the pieces that we're using. It's just because we're trying to be conservative, we're trying to cut around marks, etc. But we're upcycling to recycle these jeans because the denim is actually in quite good condition. Be quite fun to actually do this sort of a project just so as we feel like we're being environmentally friendly. So the embroidery is all single colour embroidery. We're using the Tutti Frutti pack with adding a blue into it, and it's very simple but very effective embroidery, very reminiscent of the late 60s, early 70s flower power movement, hence the Woodstock Messenger. This is the flap, so we'll be making a pair of these. So first, take this one out of the hoop, trim up the straight edges so as we get a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once those straight edges are done, we'll be able to actually mark our curved edge with a marking pencil or piece of chalk or something similar, and then trim that curve to shape. There we have a pair of flap fronts, which we will then join at a later stage. But first of all, we're just going to make some piping. So we've got a fat quarter here, and we're going to make some bias piping, because the bias goes around a curve a little bit more easily, but you don't have to. Salvage to salvage is fine. So we've found the 45 degree by folding diagonally so as your end salvage, your side salvage is connected to your ends, which will give you a 45 fold in the middle. Okay, we're using 1.5 inch strips for our piping, but if your piping cord is a bit thicker or even thinner, then you could actually either have more or less, up to you. Some people like cutting to 2-inch strips and then trimming back. The beauty about using a fat quarter is that your diagonals at the end of the cut automatically piece together easily without having to worry about, see, they fit inside each other and it's an automatic join, which is quite nice. So right sides together, 3/8 seam or 1/2 inch seam, we just clothesline piece. Press those seams open, don't have to trim the ends off just yet. And then we're going to put our piping cord inside the strip, the bias strip. So it's being enveloped inside that, and we're using our zip foot, so we want to stitch close to the cord, the piping cord, to create a ridge. And that ridge is what's going to sit outside the seam and give it a beautiful framed finish of whatever we're using the piping on. I've used piping a lot over my years. I really like it as a finish. Don't be scared of it. It's very simple. In fact, it's easier than you think. Bias piping always looks better than straight cut piping, but sometimes it's very hard to get a length for the bias when you're dealing with fat quarters and quilting fabrics. Such a waste sometimes. So I think we've got about 2 meters or 2.2 yards. And so we want to make sure that our seam allowance out from the cord is just 1/2 inch, because we want that to be even. So I've got a piping ruler here, which has a little tunnel in it which the piping cord sits in and allows you to cut a very straight edge. It's quite a nice tool, but if you don't have something like that, then you'll need to just ruler it and eyeball the half-inch seam. Right, let's make our flap up. So it's right sides together with our left and right flap piece, pin or quilt clip our top and bottom of these panels. Very important that they do line up. This pattern is quite obviously a match and it needs to match well, but on saying that, it does match very, very easily. It was a very, very little effort to get it to match. As long as the top and the bottom actually was in the right place using your perimeter stitching lines, it worked very well. Stitching just inside the seam allowance, just the needles just inside the outer perimeter stitching that we've from the embroidery. And that stops any perimeter stitching showing from the right side. It's a lovely, happy pattern. So press that seam open, and then we're going to cut a piece of lining to make the flap, to line the flap. We've just got a remnant here, and it's just an odd piece of fabric. It's full width of fabric. It should be enough to actually cut all the bits we need to cut for our messenger bag, but it won't be enough to use our pocket linings. It won't be enough. So just pin into position, trim around the edge. There's nothing really to mark other than the center. That center seam needs to be marked on the lining because it's a matching point. So where that center seam is, put a little neck in the bottom of the lining. Right. Before we sew this together, let's lay our piping cord loosely out around the edge of our work. The half-inch seam that we've actually trimmed our piping back to matches the half-inch seam on our flap. And I'm saying loosely. I don't want it to be tight because it's very easy to stretch piping and make it skinnier. I don't want that to happen. So just loosely position it. We're doing this mainly so as we can actually trim the piping, the excess piping cord off our project so as it's more manageable. You don't want that caught up. So that's what's left over. That will be used for the top of the bag. Just trim that off there. Right. Now to the machine, and we're going to stitch this around the edge using a zip foot, starting at the top right-hand corner. Swing your needle out to as far as it can go, and we want to stitch just inside the piping cord stitching. I've lengthened my stitch slightly. I've got a 3.0 stitch length, because we're going to be stitching around this a couple of times. Keep those edges together, and then at the start of the curve, snip halfway into our piping. Don't snip all the way to the seam. We just want a half snip to release the curve. And it's just around that curved area of the flap corner. As I said before, piping creates a frame. It's like a picture frame. Just that splash of colour. Lining down. Now, centre to centre. Keep that centre notched on that centre seam. That's very important. Otherwise, you'll find that the flap will twist. Clip and pin around the edge. And do the same with the other side. Put a clip at the top, and then we can ease that into place. Just make sure that lining is sitting out to the edge. Right. Now we're going to stitch around and stitch from the top so as you can see that seam allowance, that stitching line. And again, we want our needle just to graze the inside of to the left side of the stitching that's already sitting there. If you find your stitching is not straight, just go over it again. It doesn't matter. When I go around a corner, I try not to start and stop too many times. If you can get a flow, the curve is actually more even. But again, it's just practice. Right. We need to trim this seam back to half its value. So if it's a 1/2 inch seam, we trim it back to 1/4 inch. Pull the cord from inside the piping so as it's not bulky in that top seam. Do that on both sides, and then we just clip around the corners. I use little scissors to snip and clip around edges because I feel you have more control. Do that on both sides. Then we're going to pull this through, and we're going to give it a good steam press after all the piping is in position. It looks good even just turn through without even touching the iron, but no, we'll give it a press. And now it's pressed. And we just want to stitch across the top on that top stitching line just to keep that closed and make it easier to attach to the bag at the later stage. Right, before we proceed, we need to cut some pocket bags for the right hand side front pocket. So just trim along the edge. I've just got some scrap fabric, it's a double layer. And I've just trimmed a line and then moved that step up. Right, so the line doesn't have that top step. We want a pair of those. And halfway, we need the halfway mark of the step and the halfway mark on the lining, okay? Because that's really important when we actually sew this together, so as it sits in the right place. And I haven't clipped that lining on I've marked it, but I haven't clipped it. So I'm looking for my center line there. Oops, it's not there. Pop that back on. Clip those two. I marked it but didn't clip it. Right, center to center. And we're going to be sewing along the top of that with a 1/2 inch seam. And the same with the top section. That lays down, then flip it up, center to center, clip into position. And we're just going to sew across there to attach the linings to the pocket. Okay, so that's how that's going to sit, and then that will fold back and they'll be stitched into position. So you can see I've stitched the linings on there. Okay, and I've done the same with the top section. So that fold, we're going to stitch both those sides and then stitch around our pocket bag. And that opening is just for your hand to slide into. So each side, match the seams from seam allowance back to, it looks like it's about 2 centimeters, 3/4 inch. We just want to stitch those ends in for a little bit. You'll see that in a second. There and there. See, I've just stitched there and there. And then we want to flip that up. Make sure our pocket bag is in position, and we want to sew in, and we're sewing in a good inch from the edge so as the pocket bag is not too bulky in the seam. And there we have our little pocket finished. Clip into the corners, and those will be opened up to reduce some bulk. And if you want to reinforce that pocket, you could put some little bar tacks in. Look at this in a minute. We want to sew the seam, same as we did for the flap. And once that's sewn, Keep that pocket out of the way when you're sewing that seam. Open that seam up. And that should be opened underneath the pocket. When that's all pressed in position, it's good. And we could put a little bar tack there and there just to reinforce that pocket. Don't have to, it's just an option. Working with the back, we've got 4 sections. We've got the lower pocket and the upper pocket. So the upper pocket sits behind the fold of the lower pocket to create, again, a slide-in slip pocket. Join the panels together just through that straight seam, so the non-shaped seam, just join those with a 1/2 inch seam. Remember, you need to match that lower section together. Okay, so we want to join both of those. Fold that over and give it a wee press, and there's some notches on the sides there to actually indicate where to fold. And they will match the notches, the little stitch notches there at the top. They will match that to create a pocket. But before we do that, we just need to lay the lower pocket with that folded top folded down and cut out a pair of pocket bags or pocket linings. Now, we don't want this to be a big pocket and sitting in the seams if we can possibly help it. So let's put those seams, let's just trim a good 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters off around the edge of the curved edge of that pocket, so as that when it sits onto the outer panels, it's sitting in from the seam allowance, so it won't be too bulky. Right, we stitch those two like we did with the front pocket, just there and there, which again for about 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters, seam on seam. And let's attach the top pocket bag to the upper section of the back. Okay, that will be seamed across there with a 1/2 inch seam. Then attach the lower one. So again, center mark to center seam. And then that will lay on top, and that will create our pocket. There we go. And we have put a little magnetic clasp in there just to hold that pocket closed when it's in use. You can put any closure you want. You might even want to work out how to put a zip in there. Right, here's our sections. We have got front and back, and we've got our base panel and our 2 side gusset panels. We want to join the side gussets onto the base panel just with a 1/2 inch seam. They can only sew one way because they are different widths. So the gusset's got a different width top to it as it has to its bottom. We want to create a long strip. There we are, so that's one join. Let's join the other piece. We would have cut out our lining from these shapes before proceeding to this step, as in the notes. Right, open those seams up. But first of all, we need to put seam on seam and just mark our center point on that base section. The base panel needs to have a center point because that needs to match the center seam of both our front and our back. Make sure those clips are on both sides. Needs to match that center seam. Otherwise, we won't get our curves nice. Right, so let's position. Let's start with our center mark onto our center seam for our base, putting our gusset onto so we're going to start putting onto our back. So we're going to do this in three steps. We want to sew the straight sections on the base of the bag and the 2 sides of the bag. We want to just sew the straight sections, not the curved sections, because this will make it easier to create a curve. So we're sewing for about 8 inches, 4 inches either side of the center notch. Thereabouts. Might be 7 inches. Okay, so that's our first stitch. Now go up to the top and match. Slight curve. We got a slight curve on our gusset, sewing to a straight seam, but it will sew fine. and stop where the curve starts to form on the base panel. Okay, so we just it's the straight sections we're sewing on the 1, 2 at the base, and then we're going to do one more on that other side. Okay, one section, base section, and then we'll do the last one, which is here. Putting seam on seam, trying to match our seam allowance. Okay. Now we want to finish off our 2 corners. Done one there. So this is how we do it. We clip almost to the stitching line every 1/2 inch around the straight edge of the gusset strip. Not the base panel that's been joined, just the gusset strip. Every 1/2 inch or even slightly less. Then that allows the seam allowance to fan and spread and sit beautifully around that corner. It's a very simple design once the pockets are in, it really is. So we're going to sew around the edges of this. Again, we're going to go to our machine and we're going to use our zip foot with a needle all the way over to the left side, a little bit longer stitch length, so 3, and we're just going to make sure there's seam sitting on top of seam, and we're stitching just to the left hand side of that perimeter stitching. Just take your time, you do not have to rush this. Important things are that the edges are sitting flush together, so the raw seams flush together, and we've got the stitching lines sitting on top of each other before we stitch. So that's nice, no trimming needed. That should be sitting nicely. If you trim back the seam allowances too much in a bag like this, then you just trim out some of the structure. Right, we're going to work backwards. So this is putting the other side on. It's the same principle. We're doing the 3 sections, the 2 sides, and the base seam with the straight stitching, so not round the curves. Okay, so there we are. Done one. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking at the seam is sitting on top of the seam before I stitch. So that's straight edge number 2, and then we're just going to do the bottom. So we need to match that center notch onto that center join seam, and just sew for 7 to 8 inches in total. So that's 3 to 4 either side of the center line. I'm just checking to make sure that I've got no stitching showing. And then we're going to go back and do the same thing, put the zip foot back on. Needle over to the far left. I go far left and 2 clicks in. And we're just going to clip every 3/8 to 1/2 inch. So that's 1 centimetre to 1 centimetre to 1.2 centimetres apart. Just around the curve of, and it's the gusset we're clipping, not the curve of the panel, because we're sewing the gusset onto our front at the present moment. It makes no difference whether you start with the front panels or the back panels, makes no difference. Go slow, nice curve. If you have a wobble, you can always unpick a few stitches and restitch them. Don't worry about it, don't panic about it. Right, so now I've completed those seams. You might want to, I turn it through to have it checked my seams there, but then I turn it back through and give it a little bit of a press. Push something inside it, and so I can press those seams out, steam those seams corners out to make them nice and curvy. Right, before we go too much further, we need to make some loops to put onto our D-rings to attach our shoulder strap to. So cutting out our fabric, I think it's 4.5 wide, so we'll do a 3/4 of an inch seam, so a 2 centimeter seam all the way through. This strip will make 2 lots of loops. That seam is opened up, and then when it's turned through, that seam sits at the back in the middle of the underside of that loop, and the loops just slide on to like so. So let's just turn that through, and so we've made one. So what we do, and we've trimmed it in half, we've just trimmed that length in half, slide our loop on, the seam is on the inside, and we just want to just tack it together within its seam allowance. So we have a pair of loops that go at either end, centralized on that side gusset. So that's center to center on the side gusset area, and you'll find the flap just kisses the edge of that loop. Right, so I've just put a row of piping around the top of the opening of the bag. So that goes on next before we put our flap and our 2 loops on. So we just sew it round like we did with the other one. We just sew it round, but when we get to the end, we need to actually, so we've pulled the piping out, we've pulled the piping cord out of the end of the tape where we started with the piping cord, and we're going to sew up to and let the piping cords cross each other. So you'll be able to feel where the piping cord's been removed, and that's where we do our turn. So as that when that seam is folded back, you just see a little cross join, and there's no bulk, and it sits really quite nicely. It's almost invisible, not totally invisible, almost invisible. Trim off any of the overlaps from that seam allowance, because you don't want those to be giving you a visual indication of a wider seam. Trim those back, and we're now ready to actually put our flap onto the back section of our messenger bag. So lay them out center to center, be right sides together, clip it into place, clip, clip, clip. We're going to be sewing that from the inside, because we're going to be using our inside seam allowance as a guide. Then we need to add our loops onto the sides. Make sure it's center to center. And they basically just literally almost touch each other. The edge of the loop and the flap almost touch each other. They don't overlap though. They can't overlap. They're not allowed to overlap. They just need to touch each other. Okay. Then we're going to sew this into position. Again, using our zip foot and working from the inside of the bag. When I say inside of the bag, you'll see what I mean when we put it onto our machine. So the bag's still turned out, but we're just sewing that seam from the inside. Zip foot, and we're sewing through all thicknesses. Just go slow over any bulky areas. Just go slow. We've lengthened the stitch to being 3 to 3.5. Just go slowly. Don't rush. You could use a walking foot instead of a zip foot if you wish. It's up to you what you feel that's the easiest. I use a zip foot because it allows me to see where my stitches are. So I'm going through a bit of bulk here on the sides. And I've pushed my seams of my side gusset. They're pushed so as they're facing in the middle. They are pushing to the center of the gusset. They're not opened out. You could open them out if you feel like you wish to. I haven't. I've just kept them quite flat. Right. So I've given it a final press before we slip it into our lining. So there's our loops and our flap. It's looking quite smart. It's very much a fun project. So with that turned out, we're going to actually make up our lining. Now, I rescued the pockets off the back of the jeans. Don't have to do this, and there you can put a square pocket on, up to you. I thought it was a shame to throw them out, because they were in good condition. Just going to show you, I'm using a just a top stitching foot, well, a 1/4 inch foot actually. And I'm sewing awkwardly the reverse way. So I don't normally have the bulk of my work on the inside of the machine harp, but when I do patch pockets like this on jeans, I always do this, and you'll see why. So we edge stitch around the edge. This is the longest stitch. Now this denim had a little bit of stretch in it, so that's why it looks a little bit wobbly. Had a little bit of stretch in it, not much, but a little bit. 2% elastane. Stitch right up to the edge, and then we're going to stitch over 3 steps, and then down 1/4 inch away. I'm using the edge of my foot as the guide. I just find this a nice, easy way of doing it, because in a factory, they'll be using a twin needle. Right, so we've got some back patch pockets which have been utilised, and they're going to be side pockets inside the lining. So I want to halve that and just make a nick at the bottom to find my centre point. Because we have joined our gusset and created it into one, I actually stay stitched around the edge of my gusset from there with a 1/2 inch stitching, so as I had an indicator of where my seam was going to be, just to make sure that I kept the seam quite true. Now we need to leave a 6-inch gap at the bottom of one of the gusset lining front or back seams, so as we can turn the work through. So we've started with this. So we've moved down 3 inches from our centre point, and we're just going to sew our around our curve. Now I've stay stitched, so that will allow me a mark or indicator of where to clip to. Okay, so just that stay stitching, and it also makes doing this curved seam so easy, because you're just going to slide your needle down to the left hand side of the stay stitching, and everything fits beautifully. See, that curve seam just fans out when you clip into the, well, not quite to the stay stitching. There we go. First edge stitched nicely. Happy with that. Let's go up to the top. Needle to the left hand side of the stay stitching. So it's the gusset that's been stay stitched, not the actual back or front of the messenger bag. Right, come down to where our curve starts and clip every 3/8 to 1/2 inch around our curved area, edge to edge. Stitch round, and you shouldn't end up with a pleat or anything. It should be perfect. Use plenty of pins and plenty of clips if you wish. It's seriously, they're there to help you. Okay, so there's the hole that we're going to be turning our bag through eventually. Okay, so we need to attach the other side on. So same principle. We're going to be putting our centre to centre at the base, and then stitching all the way around. Once that's complete, we're going to actually slide our bag inside the lining. The lining is inside out, the bag wasn't. Putting seams on seams, and then we're going to clip all around the top and then sew with our zip foot and a 3.5 length stitch, and we're going to sew just to the left hand side of our stitching. Now this is, I'm sewing onto my first gusset side seam, so just stitch slowly because you've got a lot of weight there. You've got the bag, the piping, the lining, and you've got your folded loop. So just take it slowly, stitch by stitch by stitch, letting the machine move the fabric. Once you're off that bulk, you can just carry on whizzing around the top. Right, we're coming to our second side gusset area. Slowly. Stitch, stitch, stitch. Just slowly. Letting the machine move the work, not pulling and pushing by us. Let the machine pull the work through. I don't know whether a walking foot is any benefit with a thick seam with piping in it. It's not something I would choose to do. I think the zip foot has got enough traction by itself. You know your machine. So, before we get carried away and turn this through, we want to do just try and remove a little bit of bulk out of that top seam. So we're trimming off the edges of our seam allowance, and just that piece of stabilizer that's sitting on the panel seam, just try and trim that back to the stitching, just to get a little bit of weight out of the seam. Don't have to, but just try and get rid of a little bit of the top seam allowance out of that seam, which is going to be folded back, because I mean it's got piping inside there. I don't want to trim the seam allowance back in its value. The 1/2 inch seam allowance is absolutely fine. Just take a little bit of that bulk out. It's very important not to try and trim the structure out of a project. Sometimes we trim too much, whereas a good iron and a press and some steam actually does a world of good compared to trimming. But a little bit of that bulk out of that top seam is ideal. Almost there. Snip, snip, snip. Just snip around, just release that edge around the sides. Just release that edge a little bit. I prefer to do this than trim the seam back. Then we're going to fold the messenger bag in half inside, and then berth it through the hole of the lining. Take your time. It actually comes through very easily. There's our flap. There's our lining. Okay. I usually pop everything in and have a quick look at it before I finish off the lining hole. Let's have a quick look to make sure there's nothing surprising. Oh, it's looking lovely. So just pull that lining out. This is going to have a good press to get that piping cord into place. Pull that lining out, clip that seam closed, so it's 1/2 inch seam, top stitch that seam closed by machine to make it nice and sturdy. straight stitch or even a zigzag along the edge, does not matter. Okay, just that bottom section. Then push it back into the bag, and we have completed our Woodstock Messenger Bag. A great fun project, lovely, bright and vibrant, but it does look good as a single colour embroidery as well. Have seen that in one of our samples. It's very, very nice. Either way, have fun with the project.